Yo, what is going on, everybody? It's Brave Cat here, once again with another Frontier Signals update. So I'm going to do things a little bit in reverse order here, and I've taken a small break from the coding and some of these projects going on here, just to give myself a little bit of a refresher and kind of get the steps forward that I need to take next. This website's probably going to remain on GitHub for the time being. I know GitHub is, like a repository website, but, that being said, I think the website I'm making pretty much is a repository for information, resources, data feeds. So I think it's pretty fitting so far. But anyways, so taking things in reverse order than usual, and take a quick look at the volcanic activity and go from there. So pretty much everything in the descriptive events for volcano discovery is a pretty long list, but everything has remained at the same hazard levels, so nothing has gone up or down really. But that being said, there's 8 of them here in Japan, 3 of them throughout the Philippines, another 8 of them going all the way across Indonesia, and then 3 in Alaska. And combining Central and South America, there's another 6. And that's just for the descriptive events, at the very bottom here, which, okay, normally it's there. So if we take a look at the full list here, and this is from yesterday, there's always a lot of volcanoes going off pretty regularly. I think the average is literally about 40 volcanoes actively erupting. So nothing has gone really too far past the average, but we've still had some, pretty significant blasts recently, especially out of Kamchatka. Looks like that has kind of simmered out though. So, alright, we need to take a look at what is going on in Italy, because when I saw this, I was like, huh. So this is all within the last 24 hours here. This is the most activity I've seen in this area by far. So kind of zooming it out here, pretty much everything is going on down here south. So it's not directly underneath or by the, the main 2 volcanoes anybody should be worried about. So, Mount Vesuvius and Campi Flegrei still have some activity here, but again, those are all very tiny tremors. But what we see here is this. Well, it was a 5 that I was looking at, and then I went on here, and I saw there's an entire cluster swarm of earthquakes going on here. So we have a 4.3, a 5.2, a bunch of mid-range and upper 2s, and just a couple tremors. So something's definitely going on over here. There's also a 4.1 closer to the coast, and then this other swarm here seems to be quite frequent for earthquakes, but again, this looks to be pretty exaggerated here. So there's another 4, 3.3, and again a whole bunch of 2s. So yeah, this is by far the most stuff I've seen going on in this region. So we take a look at that here. We have the 5.2, and there's plenty of station details on that. It seems to be pretty accurate, so I'm not too worried about that. But, I don't really know what kind of, alert or potential hazards we should expect here. These all seem to be pretty shallow in depth, so I don't think this is really anything to worry about with the magma chambers. But, it's definitely just the plate itself is moving. And I mean, this is right on the boundary pretty much. So taking things over here to my little earthquake map here, you've got some other underwater volcanoes over here. And we take a look at the tectonic plate. And, it's right here, it runs right along through here. So it's definitely plate movement. I don't think it has really much to do with the magma chambers. And they're all shallow, so that's at least the good news. But there's been just so much going on here in Europe. Another 5 struck around Greece, and that's just been ongoing. Same thing with Western Turkey. So then we take things, while we have a new 6.7 that reportedly struck in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Pretty large for an earthquake to strike out here. Usually you see those kinds of earthquakes strike right along some of these other boundaries, or like down here, or really anywhere around here. So potentially a bit of a rare earthquake. I mean, this is right along, this fault line that runs through the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But again, still a little bit uncommon for that. And we still have a surplus of seismic activity going on here in the Pacific Northwest going into the US. So there's been a series of continued 3s in that sort of range going along the west coast. And the tremor map hasn't had a whole lot in the past few days, but where we see these small groups of slow slip events, that's pretty much exactly where we see this series of events going off the coast here. And once again, the tremor swarm ongoing near the San Francisco Bay Area. Still going on, hasn't gone away, hasn't really slowed down. Looking up here in Alaska, still lots of stuff going on here with the volcanic activity. And other than that, we've still had the usual 5s pumping out of Indo-Australia and whatnot, going up here into Japan. But other than that, pretty much wraps up the earthquake activity for the day. I think the stuff going around in Italy, that is pretty much kind of the main focus point here. Especially for Europe, I feel like, we haven't really seen this kind of activity go on like it has. So definitely something to keep an eye on. So now going back to the space weather, and there's, a couple things at the end I will cover. But, it's been pretty quiet on the sun, and it seems like we have more or less kind of gone through the potential events here. So the Enlil spiral is still showing the same period of time here. So we had that first CME, and then the combination of the ones following that. But, we're not out of the woods yet. They do have predicted more geostorms going through today and tomorrow. Should be pretty minor. We've also had the coronal hole is starting to make its way out, so I don't think we're going to have really much more in terms of coronal hole activity with the solar wind. And, now we're going to be looking towards the next region of sunspots. So those are getting pretty close here. This green region is just about to start peeking over. So we can just beginning to see that here with these bright active regions on the very edge. And let's see, I think that pretty much, for the most part, does it for the kind of geophysical side of it. So we've got a couple updates here regarding the fires. So we still got this stuff going on up here in Nebraska. Seems like it's mostly contained, so this one's 98% contained. And, between all these here, it's pretty much about 1 million acres combined. So pretty major stuff. Again, these are major areas for cattle farming and, growing the food to sustain those cattle. So I'm not sure if we could see some sort of hit with, meat prices and other agriculture related things. And then, so the, the Eastern Plains, definitely on fire. And then down here at the Front Range, got a pretty gnarly fire here, pretty much closing off this highway down here in between Colorado Springs and Penrose. And, this seems like it's just getting worse at this point. It's now 0% contained, and it's at 1,100 acres. So, a little bit heavy on the fire warnings considering we're only in March. So, I'm not sure what's going to happen for the rest of the spring and summer, but, I guess just be prepared for that. Let's see, I forgot to take a look at the Canada feed because it's always a pain to look at. In fact, I'm already done looking at it. I don't think anything significant has gone on in between. At least that's been reported anyway. So moving on here, just a quick update on that cyclone that was hitting Australia. Looks like it's been pretty much downgraded all the way to just a tropical storm, so not too much going on there. And then the last thing I want to hit over here on X. So one of the biggest interests that I've had over the past decade is, regarding ancient civilization and a lot of these megalithic structures around the world. And there's definitely some really good people to follow over here on X. So we've got Open-Minded Approach, Ethical Skeptic. He goes into these things along with his ECDO theories of, Earth crustal displacement and cycles that happen. And then, of course, Jimmy Corsetti, he is just the top tier ancient civilization guy. I don't care what anyone else says. He is the man for that. And another good account follow here is Megalithic Mysteries. There's a lot of accounts I've followed kind of around these topics, and some of them I've already unfollowed because, a lot of them, they'll put out AI slop or things that are just literally not even factual. So, hoping to kind of narrow that down. And, these are some pretty good choices. I know Open-Minded Approach, he has a pretty wide variety of stuff that he talks about. Some of it may or may not be, kind of take it with a grain of salt, rather, but, it really opens up the perspective and the imagination for what is possible and what is likely. So anyways, that will wrap things up for today's video. Hope y'all enjoyed, got something out of it. Please like and subscribe for more. Share this video if you dare, and I'll catch you all in the next.